Hello and welcome back to NeuroKnow, your one-stop station for all psych talk. Today we have a good one. We're talking about bias. Bias is everywhere, even in places like the government and our own homes. Everybody has some sort of bias, but in psychology, it's a lot harder to find. Today, we're met with Dr. Taylor Vargo. She's going to tell us a little bit more about how bias can hold statistics in kind of a harmful place, where not only do we see that bias can misinterpret statistics, but also that even our unconscious bias can hurt the interpretation of them in general. This is one of the fields that Taylor Vargo is very prominent on, and ultimately has a lot of research and practice into. So thank you for joining us on this journey. Let's get right into the interview. I'm here today with Taylor Vargo. Got her PhD at Kansas State. She is a professor at Simpson College, teaching a multitude of psychology classes, one being statistics. She talks a lot about prejudice in that class. What got you into statistics and psychology in general?
One of the first classes that I taught while I was getting my PhD was research methods, to where I still have to be able to talk about statistics and how you use statistics to inform methods and designs of studies, and you use them to support conclusions. And then it was just a natural progression into statistics from there. So I've been teaching statistics. This is my first semester doing it, but it is in my future that I get to keep doing it along with research methods.
How did prejudice shape those studies, and how did you avoid prejudice throughout those studies as much as you could?
Yes, I am a cognitive psychologist by training, so it is not inherent in the material that I am interested in, or at least the way it was taught at the time, to actually care or think about prejudice. But as I continued at K-State through my master's and my dissertation, I became what people often call a social psychologist, like hidden version. So I pretend to be cognitive, but I'm actually social, is what people say. So I do care about individual differences, how they influence ultimately cognitive related things. So then as I'm doing my research, I try to use that idea to inform the types of participants that I'm collecting, how I'm reporting and highlighting those participants, how different they are, if they're not different. And oftentimes the participants that I get aren't super different. So I do have majority of like white, cisgender individuals, because that is just naturally what's available on college campuses. But then a lot of my future directions, conclusions, big ideas tend to stem from the lack of diversity that my studies actually have. So that tends to be a personal interest of mine, to make sure that I am accurately representing more than just who is able to go to colleges.
I see. So a lot of your research then is based around making sure you have that kind of diversity, and if not, it's really outlined in your research in general, would you say?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So if you're a student coming up through the college level of statistics, what's some ideas you would have to avoid prejudice on an academic standpoint? Make sure that you're not bringing some bias into some of your research.
I think the biggest thing to remember is that the data sets that are often going to be used, just historically, what has been collected and investigated has been on certain populations. So keeping all of that in mind when you're really learning about anything, even just talking about big theories or big ideas from different areas, often that data comes from certain people. So keeping in mind when you are doing anything, but especially stats, that when you have participants, it is really hard to be able to accurately say that your data is actually representing the entire population. And you have to consider that different genders, different races do actually have differences in behaviors, differences in cognition that cannot be avoided. There are certain things that do just exist naturally.
Seeing as psychology is more of a newer type of science compared to a lot of the other sciences, how do you deal with avoiding implicit bias or bias in general when teaching it, especially since all of the studies for psychology are riddled with bias in different ways?
Oh, yes. One of the ways that I like doing this is an intro to psych, where in the first week or 2 weeks, I tell everyone that we have this problem where white, middle-class Americans are who we are often talking about throughout the semester. And I do my best to find more recent studies that have focused on other populations to show some of those differences, and that those differences aren't bad. I think it's always good to highlight that the differences that exist are fine. It's normal. People are different. But to highlight that some of these big groundbreaking cases that we found early on in psych actually only apply to certain people, and that it's really important to remember that as we move through the semester. And I would say that's one of my bigger goals as well, is to integrate those kinds of ideas into other classes and to keep that in mind even when you're doing stats.
Interesting. All in all, where do you see prejudice in psychology kind of heading towards? Is it in a positive state right now, or is it heading on a downward slope?
So I think actual psychologists are in a place where we understand that prejudice exists, bias exists. We can't avoid it. It is there. And I think that there are a good majority of people that want to move forward and start to address some of those issues. But I will say, given the political climate that we are in, there are a lot of negative things also happening. And it is hard to avoid those things, unfortunately. Even when you think about things like at the government level, certain things are being removed or hidden, or DEI policies are being completely avoided, it is impacting research directly. So I have a friend who is currently in grad school, and the research she was doing was related to DEI policies, what those policies are, how they actually impact people in different businesses at different levels, and she can't do that research anymore. There are some negatives that are happening that are outside of our control, but for those of us that can still actively do something, I think there are still positive strides being made.
As we wrap this up, what kind of comments do you have for anyone listening at home, just wanting to know about prejudice or statistics in general?
I think that statistics are really informative. I think they can be really useful, but I also think they can be misused. I think it is really easy to make statistics say things that aren't actually accurate. I actually have a book that is called How to Lie with Statistics, and it shows you how easy it is to take numbers and make them say what you want them to. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that understanding statistics is one thing, but understanding where those statistics come from and what they actually mean is another thing. So there are multiple levels to understanding and using statistics so that it actually can be informative and useful.
Thank you guys for tuning in to NeuroKnow. Next week, we're going to be talking about statistics on a broader scheme, maybe going into a little bit of biology. Thank you, Taylor Vargo, for joining us on this adventure.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you guys for listening.